and the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits, Beth Steinhorn, President of VQ Strategies.
Thank you, Joan, and thanks to everyone for joining today. It's so wonderful to be joining you this morning, whereas I noted I'm feeling like the clouds are parting and looking forward to a sunny day. It's wonderful to see so many familiar names and faces. Well, some faces, haven't been able to see them all yet, but see so many familiar names on the participant list, and I'm delighted to be meeting some of you for the first time as well. As Joan mentioned, I'm Beth Steinhorn, President of VQ Volunteer Strategies, and we work with organizations across the US and Canada, and have worked with organizations across New Hampshire for many years on volunteer engagement strategy. Well, our topic today is building back better. And one thing we can certainly say about the past 14 months is that it has been a year of change. We can say a lot of things, but let's focus on this perspective. It certainly has been a year of change. I think if you had asked most of us at the beginning of March a year ago to predict the activities in terms of volunteer engagement over the coming year, very few would have said in-person volunteering would be severely curtailed, that the highlights of volunteer gatherings would be when somebody's cat or puppy made an appearance crawling across the screen, or that we would be viewing all of our workspaces now in increments of 6-foot boxes, and that our biggest fashion decision each morning would be whether our mask clashes with the outfit that we're wearing today. And yet, here we are. Fortunately, we're at a point where we can really begin to map out a new future that, while we seem to have some sunshine in these parting clouds, there's still a great deal of uncertainty. So as we begin to map out how we're going to engage volunteers in the future, leverage this all-important strategy for our organizations and our communities, I'd like to start by looking at a few trends briefly prior to the pandemic, because those who've heard me train before know that one of my favorite sentiments is that ignored trends equal missed opportunities. If we ignore the trends, it's not fading us to a doomed future, but it does mean we might be missing some opportunities to leverage these trends on behalf of our organizations, our communities, and our mission. So in the spirit of embracing this choice, learning about trends so we can make an educated decision to leverage them or stick our head in the proverbial sand and work despite them, I'd like to start by just talking about some trends prior to the pandemic, because I really believe that the events and the associated restrictions of the pandemic actually accelerated many things that were already in the works. So that's really the theme of today. What are those accelerated trends once the pandemic really hit and we began to have to re-engineer how we engage volunteers so that we can determine which ones we want to carry with us as we move forward and which we might want to leave behind as we're able to change. As many of you are likely aware, after years of declining rates of volunteering in this country, 2017 saw a significant increase, a boost in volunteering, where nationally we shot up, and the state of New Hampshire also mirrored that, in fact, led in some ways that spike in volunteering. New Hampshire has a long history of out volunteering the rest of the nation. There's a great legacy of rolling up your sleeves and helping your community and taking action. So here's the national rate over the last 15, 16 years from 2004 to 2017, which is the last year for which we have national data. And here's New Hampshire outpacing the US, but generally mirroring the trends with a big spike in 2017. So as I always like to say, those of you in New Hampshire are already starting with an asset of a spirit of volunteerism among your communities, rather than some other states, I won't call any out at the moment, where you have to make the case to volunteer. Here or where you are in New Hampshire, you need to make the case to volunteer with your organization, but you're not also trying to convince people that volunteering is a valuable activity. So when I think about the trends that were shaping volunteerism over the last 10 years, really. And I could spend hours talking about these, but I won't, because I want to get to the more recent trends. But these are the 6 that I think have been most prominent in showing up in terms of research, showing up in terms of the work that we see affecting our clients. And I invite you to weigh in using the chat. I'll try and monitor if you have thoughts on any of these or additions to my list. But I'm going to take just a couple minutes to talk about these 6. First is, of course, the way people view time. We're very accustomed to, most of us hear from potential volunteers, my time is really limited. We hear our friends and colleagues saying, I'm really, really busy. And yet we also know that people make time for things they value and for things for which they feel valued. So there's a real motivation for us to really articulate why spending time with our organization will be meaningful, impactful, efficient, and a worthy use of somebody's time. Laura asks, is this data based upon records that nonprofit organizations provide or based on random surveys? The data around the volunteer rates are from from AmeriCorps, which is the relatively new name for the National Corporation for National and Community Service. It's based on general population surveys in the years when the federal government includes questions about volunteering. So the last year for which questions on volunteering were asked was 2017. And prior to that, it skipped back to 2015 and then was most years before that. So that's where that data from the previous slides came from. These, the other pieces of information I'm going to be sharing come from a variety of sources, but not necessarily surveys. We know from the same data source, Laura, that volunteers, while volunteering rates have gone up, the number of hours that on average, each volunteer gives per year continues to drop. In fact, kind of plummet. I don't have this slide in the deck, but I think that between 2015 and 2017, the average number of hours per year that any one volunteer gives on average dropped from 123 or 124 hours per year to 89 hours per year. It was 120 something down to 80 something. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it's a pretty significant drop. So we also know from data that volunteers are on average serving fewer hours per year. And I hear from clients and surveys and all sorts of things that organizations are seeing people wanting more flexible short-term commitments and being more reluctant to commit to 4 hours a week for an entire year, signing on the dotted line. But I'm happy to have you all weigh in and see. Another big factor over the last 10 years is, of course, technology. Technology makes volunteering, it not only makes virtual volunteering, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today, more possible, but it really changes the nature of work. It makes remote work possible, but it also gives us the opportunity to really transform every individual who's connected with our organization into a talent scout on behalf of our organization. Because if we're strategic, if we're intentional, we can arm our volunteers, board members who are volunteers, program participants, staff with messages to share with their networks online to become ambassadors on behalf of our organization. So if we leverage it smartly, and strategically, we can really have technology work on our behalf. And yet it also creates some more competition, because anyone can, no one needs to knock on your door anymore. You can just, look on your phone and apply for 3 volunteer positions just while you're on a break between sessions or meetings at work. So again, we have to make sure we're there with the right messages and follow up quickly. Economics. So we learned in 2009, in the recession that was unleashed around 2009 with the mortgage crisis, that as we had at the time record unemployment, people really were leveraging volunteering as a pathway to work, as a way to keep their resumes fresh, to gain new skills, and to keep them on a path back to work. Right now, we're hopefully, I'll be sunny and optimistic, turning the corner out of an unprecedented, challenging times that were unprecedented in terms of unemployment and limited employment and changing employment situations due to the pandemic and the associated restrictions. And yet volunteering has been constricted in some ways. Yet the interest, as I'll share, is really, really high to still volunteer. And so we have an opportunity to leverage that and help connect volunteering to work and pathways to work, because the ties, the connection between economics, work, and volunteering continue to be really intertwined. We also see an evolving philanthropy. When I started in this career a number of decades ago, we had development departments and we had volunteer engagement departments. And at the time, actually, I was in program research departments. And nary did they really meet. And yet the field is really seeing, and data supports this, that volunteering is one facet of philanthropy. People give their time where they give their money. People give their money where they give their time. And when people who are used to giving money don't have as much money to give, they consider volunteering. And volunteers contribute non-volunteers. Volunteers are almost twice as likely to contribute financially to organizations than non-volunteers. And so the more we can begin to see volunteering as part of philanthropy and part of an overall strategy that looks at how are people in relationship with our mission as ambassadors, maybe as financial donors, maybe as volunteers, maybe as one of those things during this phase of their life, and then as a program participant in another phase, the more we can sustain our missions and enrich the organization and the community. And I won't do this all the time, but Laura, since you asked about data, if you're interested in data around giving, there's some from the National Corporation, but also there's some great data from US Trust and Fidelity Trust around the connections between volunteering and giving. There are changes in social trends, certainly movement building, and we've seen, especially in the last year, the largest mobilization of citizens in this country around causes around racial equity, and in fact, data shows that a very significant portion of individuals who showed up for many of these rallies and protests had never participated in that type of citizen civic engagement before. And so we have, thanks to technology as well, an opportunity to mobilize people and leverage that interest in being mobilized for causes that they care about, and really look at how could volunteerism learn a little from that kind of community organizing, and are there ways to overlap? We're going to talk a little bit about that. And finally, the last piece is, of course, a generational shift, that our systems in volunteering and nonprofits were built by and for the greatest and silent generation volunteers, those individuals who were born before and during World War II. And that really set up the infrastructure, the construct of volunteering in the 20th century in this country. And yet, starting with boomers, and on through Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z have really brought different expectations and motivations to volunteering. And organizations that haven't been shifting aren't necessarily keeping up strategically in engaging in ways that are meaningful, ways that leverage people's skills, that offer flexible opportunities to volunteer, and really are clear in articulating what the impact is. And that really was that challenge was first brought 15 years ago by Boomer generation and has been certainly echoed and even amplified by subsequent generations. So these 6 trends were really shaping volunteerism in this country over the last 10 to 15 years. And then of course, COVID hit last March, at least in the United States, and things changed. Very quickly, nonprofits and public institutions were challenged. As early as June, 3 months into this, 54% of nonprofits were offering new programs or services, yet 9 in 10 were negatively effective. A third believed that they would likely be shut down within the subsequent 12 months. Only a third of leaders were confident that they could sustain their operations, and many had already ceased operations. And among those that were closing, nearly 2/3 were closing because they were unable to provide services or programs virtually. And 31% could not do volunteer-based activities because of shelter at home restrictions. And yet, even then, volunteers, while cautious, were more interested in virtual volunteer opportunities. And of course, many organizations were able within a few months to begin to pivot. This is, I think, a great statement on organizational adaptability. This was a study by Volunteer Match put out at the end of last year, December 2020, showing the interest in the shifts in volunteer engagement practices among organizations, not volunteers, but organizations. So in March, only 2% had begun creating more in-person volunteer opportunities. That got up to 7% by October. But of course, the big number here is the percentage of organizations that began to create more virtual volunteer opportunities, from a third to up to over a half by October. My guess is, and it's not a guess, I know, that has only continued in subsequent months. And so I'd love to get your voices in the room. I'm going to launch a poll here and find out, let's see, you should see on your screen a poll that asks you, and you can select more than one, which of the following apply to your organization. In the last year, we have increased volunteer opportunities, increased virtual trainings, changed policies and procedures, recruited new volunteers, or put most volunteering on hold. So I'm going to give us a moment. You can all sing the little Jeopardy song in your head while we're giving you a moment to weigh in. And I'll be interested in seeing which of these practices sort of describe your organization's experience. Okay, thank you. We've got almost 80% of you voting. So I'm gonna, now we're at 80%. I'm gonna close the poll in 3, 2, get your last votes in, 1, and I'm gonna close and I will share the results. What we see here, you sort of echo the national data that we have in terms of the Volunteer Match survey. Well over half, 60% of you have increased virtual volunteer opportunities. Great to see that 45% of you have increased virtual trainings. Not surprised, but great to see that. Of course, that means 55% of you haven't increased. Maybe you were already doing it. Maybe you just haven't been able to crack that nut yet. 53% have changed policies and procedures. Over a third have recruited and engaged new volunteers. I'm thrilled to hear that. And yet just over a third, 36%, have put most volunteering on hold. So hopefully for those who have put it on hold, today we'll be able to give you some ideas of ways you might be able to continue to tap into volunteer talent. And certainly I hope you'll connect with peers on that. And for those who haven't yet kind of been adapting, this will give you some inspiration to do so. I'll just share another data source from Volunteer Pro's annual Volunteer Management Progress Report from January of 2021, which includes research not just from the US, but some reports more globally as well. And again, I won't read through them all, but pretty much echoes, you're right in line with a lot of the rest of the world, right? Lots of more virtual opportunities, changes to policies and procedures. And so the Volunteer Management Progress Report is a great resource if you kind of want to see, just benchmark your practices against others. Here's where I think the big news is. The big news is, what are volunteers, not just what are organizations doing, but what is our opportunity in looking at the volunteer landscape, what volunteers are interested in doing. And last year, Points of Light published a study late last year, Civic Life Today, asking volunteer survey respondents, or not just volunteers, individual Americans, survey respondents, to share what types of civic activities they engaged in the previous year. And interestingly, the lowest, but still a significant number, participated in volunteering. This was looking back prior to the pandemic. 36% of these individuals volunteered in the previous year. But double that, 73%, more than double, say that volunteering will be more important than ever after the coronavirus. So we have, a third of the country saying, I volunteered prior to the pandemic, but 2/3 are saying volunteering is going to be more important than ever. Now, if you're a little cynical, you might be saying, yeah, they may say volunteering is going to be important, but are they actually going to roll up their sleeves and volunteer? And the answer is, according to the survey, yes, a lot of them plan to. 60% of adults were interested in volunteering, and almost half of those hadn't volunteered previously. So for those of you, I can't remember the exact survey results, but maybe it was around 1/3 of you said that you've engaged new volunteers this year. The other 2/3 of you, listen up, because there are people interested who hadn't volunteered before, who want to volunteer now. So I think that is a really positive outlook, a real call to action for all of us to think about how we're going to be ready to engage these people. How are we going to build back so that these individuals have a place and an opportunity to serve with our missions? We have had to re-engineer how we engage volunteers over the last year. And these new methods, these innovations, or at least accelerated trends, will be a key part of really our discussion today. What are the new protocols that are important to keep? Do we want to keep this shift to virtual? Have we created new roles for volunteers? That's really what I want to spend the remaining time today chatting about. But I would be remiss if I didn't also acknowledge that the pandemic revealed cracks in our system. And I know we've touched on some of these in previous sessions already in various ways at this conference. We know that the pandemic has exacerbated really every crack in volunteer engagement that existed, but that we might have been ignoring or glossing over. Things like issues of diversity and equity in volunteer engagement, gaps in access to technology, digital access. Is volunteer engagement a strategic commitment of your organization? Was it viewed as a program that could be cut or put on hiatus when your organization was struggling with budget or decisions around what services to continue amid the pandemic restrictions? Or was it immediately viewed as a strategy that would be vital to your organization's response and your community's recovery? And finally, funding. Is volunteer engagement viewed as part of your organization and community's COVID relief or not, right? And does the philanthropic community that you're connected with view it that way? It's especially relevant as we continue to work with funders, and many funding sources are looking at saying, we're shifting our priorities and we're doing all COVID relief. Is volunteer engagement, is engaging volunteers to help your communities recover from the pandemic and the events of the last year, is that viewed as a valid ask by your leadership and by the funders with whom you're connected? That's a critical issue that we need to drive that conversation on. It's up to us to drive that conversation. On a national level, there's definitely conversations happening. I'm a founder and board member of the National Alliance for Volunteer Engagement, which is a coalition of organizations that seeks to really change the conversation and ensure that volunteer engagement is leveraged as a core strategy. This predates the pandemic, but we're doing a lot of work with funders and the philanthropic community to help them see that volunteers aren't free. Engaging volunteers takes an investment, and they are a valuable, vital resource to help us recover from the pandemic. So that's a big piece, which anyone wants to talk to me about. Obviously, I love hopping on that soapbox. So happy to chat more about that. So I think those cracks and maybe some others: diversity, equity, and inclusion, digital divide, strategic commitment, and funding, certainly add more perspective, context as we look ahead to the light at the end of this tunnel. It's up to us, and this is the right time to think about, are we going back to the old ways? Once we reopen, are we just going to do things the way we were always doing them? Or are we going to carry forward some of the elements of our innovations? We have this opportunity to seize the moment to rewrite the rules of engagement that have guided our work, and in some cases created and maybe even exacerbated those cracks. I'm not suggesting we throw out all those best practices and rules, because they have certainly provided a foundation, but we need to build on the best and adapt to our new reality. So I want to talk about 5 trends or structures that have really been accelerated, as I've seen working with hundreds of organizations in the last year and following the research, as a result of the pandemic or in response to the pandemic. And I'll also put in a little plug that each of these topics is also a topic for a webinar, which is a follow-up series to this session. For anyone who's interested, it's being hosted in partnership with the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits. And so if any of these are of interest, we're going to be going deep into each of these in the subsequent 5-6 weeks. So I'll share information about that at the end. The first is recruitment and partnerships. How are we thinking about recruitment differently? How are organizations leveraging partnerships in new ways? Of course, there's virtual volunteering and enhanced virtual training. The pandemic has also really inspired many to rethink retention. I don't know how many of you will resonate with this, but I can't tell you how many colleagues and clients I've heard, especially at the beginning of 2021, saying, boy, my 2021 data points really took a hit because, we're used to reporting on hours and how many volunteers were retained, but those metrics, really showed up pretty differently in 2020. So I think it really is incumbent upon us to rethink what retention looks like and add extra measures to it that are more realistic, not just to make us look good in 2020, but to equip us for really a future that frankly was here even before the pandemic. Measuring impact, again, the events of last year has forced many of us, unless you were in a food pantry or some other organization that provided essential services where you were suddenly engaging more volunteers and delivering more meals and had a huge increase in your hours, for most, measuring impact really has, we've been challenged to focus only on hours, which I think is a good thing. It forces us to get beyond that. And then finally, we've really had to be more creative in considering who's part of our community and how do we nurture a community in this increasingly hybrid world. So let's start with recruitment and partnerships. And I'll also just put in a note, a little reminder. Please feel free to add questions or any comments to the chat. We'll be monitoring that throughout. And if I may, we'll either hold them to the end, or if it's timely, we'll try and address it right then and there. So prior to the pandemic, I heard very often from organizations, well, when we partner with someone else, with another organization, the real question is, can we get there? Whose volunteers are they, right? Who gets the data? Who gets to count the hours? There was this, unfortunately, common turf mentality, a yours, mine, and ours, or maybe just the yours and mine of volunteer engagement. And yet, one of the things I saw so quickly, even by the end of March last year, was an incredible openness to getting beyond that mentality, to be much more fluid in partnerships with organizations and even individuals, free agent volunteers, in new ways. Within days of the pandemic in New York City, an organization called Invisible Hands Deliver, I think I have a picture of it, yeah. Invisible Hands Deliver was formed by a bunch of, actually just 3 young adults who were able to deliver and do errands for homebound individuals at risk. They stood up this website, they funneled other young people who were suddenly finding themselves working from home and yet had time and didn't feel that they were at as much risk health-wise, and they were able to connect them to individuals, matching them for errands, et cetera. This is all sort of, I'm sure you're all saying, oh yeah, we did that in Manchester, or we did that in, in the North Country, but it was, for a lot of, even though it's more normal now, it was pretty earth-shattering for some of these communities back in March of last year. Of course, I think that proper screening and background checks are still a best practice for reaching vulnerable communities, but organizations like Invisible Hands Deliver offered a safe and really nimble way to serve thousands of people really quickly. And it continues today as a partner with food pantries and senior supporting organizations. And nobody's fighting about who gets the data and who gets to count the hours. It's about connecting interested, motivated volunteers to people who have needs. We also see this, it's a similar kind of reflection of mutual aid organizations. I interviewed a woman from St. Louis Mutual Aid who, and like so many other mutual aid societies, it's a real, it's an incredible phenomenon where I might want to label it with terms like informal volunteerism. But the reality is they don't see it among mutual aid societies. They don't see it as volunteerism. People aren't defined as givers or receivers. People join a mutual aid community, and in this one in St. Louis, if they have funds to give, they give funds. If they have time to give, they give time. Some people who we might consider to be recipients, people who received funds to help them out of immediate crises, pivoted and became educators and sort of ambassadors for the mutual aid to others in their community. I heard stories about women in the sex work industry who were suddenly out of work, who needed aid, but were scared to come forward to receive that aid. And so one woman who had come forward became an educator to others in her community who would then also serve and deliver meals or do other things. So people see themselves as an active part of the mutual aid, not as a label of a volunteer, a donor, an organizer. And as Aislinn weighs in from Volunteer New Hampshire, mutual aid is very in right now, and I'm delighted to hear that you have a few groups in New Hampshire doing some great work, and perhaps there are some ways that your organization might want to potentially partner with them if there's interest in that. Another example from a great article by my colleague Carmeet Bowman from the Minnesota Association for Volunteer Administration. She talked about this new opportunity for volunteer engagement leaders to connect with informal volunteering. And Minnesota COVID Sitters is one of them. When clinical rotations got canceled for spring semester last year, a group of medical students from the University of Minnesota formed this Minnesota COVID Sitters. These students they organized to offer free childcare, pet sitting, running errands for medical professionals, many of whom were their teachers and rotation supervisors while they were in school. And they felt compelled to help them, especially since they were dedicating their time being on the front lines of the COVID response. And the group is now open beyond just medical students to any college-age student who wants to help, offering new services to anyone who works in the healthcare facility. And they've certainly built their internal capacity by engaging volunteers and skilled volunteers to create the site and all of that. But it's a great example of this informal volunteering and grassroots organizing happening. Just people are getting stuff done without worrying about, do I need a 501c3? Do we need a board? Do we need this? Do we need that? Let's just get the people who want to help to the people who need help. And if a structured nonprofit can help broker that, great. And if they can be part of that, great. But it takes a little shift in mindset, and for some, a big shift in mindset among the traditional nonprofits to be able to say, what's our role and how can we help facilitate this and get the need out there. And I think the pandemic has really helped do that. Let's shift to our second key trend, which is virtual volunteering. I want to be really clear. Virtual volunteering existed long before March of last year. And depending on whose definition you use, some say it started with the advent of the internet, but I actually think it existed long before that, because if you think of it as remote volunteering, then certainly there were people working remotely and volunteering remotely and checking in every once in a while, long before we were as connected through email and internet and phones, et cetera. But this trend certainly was accelerated at lightning speed over the last year. There are lots of reasons to engage volunteers virtually. Certainly the health restrictions of the pandemic made it so that people were only comfortable in many cases and safe volunteering from their homes, but also there are economic reasons to do this. Engaging virtual volunteers can help us steward our financial resources more effectively. And another piece of the COVID, which is really the economics of it, and that is that many people were laid off, yet have skills, and we know it's a viable addition to their resume to volunteer, even if virtually, and it helps keep people connected to your mission. Virtual volunteering increases accessibility for people in different geographies, people with different physical abilities. It helps make volunteering possible for volunteers, for individuals who care about your mission, no matter their, again, ability, location, et cetera. It can absolutely help diversify our workforce. It's an opportunity to begin to heal some of those cracks in our infrastructure in terms of engaging people with physical disabilities, engaging people in rural areas who might not be able to drive or have access to transportation to get into more of our metropolitan centers. Obviously, there are issues, it's challenged by the digital divide and limited accessibility, and rural areas have a more challenging time accessing and having, connectivity, reliable internet connectivity. But engaging virtually doesn't always have to be over Zoom like this. You can serve virtually making phone calls. You can serve virtually doing work at home and sending it in other means. So it doesn't always have to rely on internet connectivity. And of course, engaging volunteers with skills and time helps build our capacity. It's all about mission delivery. One of the trends I saw and heard, and I'd be curious, feel free to weigh in if you experience this as well, is that in addition to creating some new roles or creating some new roles for volunteers to contribute virtually, say as Zoom tutors and making phone calls to isolated seniors, things like that. We also see roles that were traditionally expected to be done in person having to be shifted to virtual, things like committee meetings, board meetings. And I heard from lots of organizations that attendance at committee and board meetings, once they went virtual, really became much more consistent and reliable. Now, granted, I also understand that that is partly due to the fact that people didn't have a lot of plans and weren't traveling as much, so they were around a lot more. But the question is, how do we bring that forward? Do we want to continue to adapt our bylaws to say that committee and board meetings don't have to happen in person? Can they continue to happen virtually? Even if you move them to in person for those who want them, can you have a hybrid meeting and have people dial in if they're unavailable? Because it did increase engagement for many organizations, is what I heard and experienced. Of course, part of this virtual volunteering piece is online training. And there are tremendous benefits to online training. It creates the potential for more flexibility, especially if things are recorded and available on demand. It creates more accessibility. I remember when I first started working with the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits and the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation back in 2013, we worked with an organization, well, I won't name it per se, but there was an organization up in the north that I know was really challenged because they due to the nature of their work, they had to require more than 30 hours of training. And it was all at that time being done on site. And yet it was a long drive, and I know what the weather's like, and it's hard. It was hard to attract new volunteers. And so one of their big pilot projects was to adapt their training so that some of those 30 hours could be done virtually. And again, this was 2013, 2014, so that was less common then. And only the critical pieces that needed to really be done in person were required to be done in person. And that transition opened up and made accessible the volunteer role to so many more people who cared about this issue. It can be more efficient to engage or train volunteers virtually, and that especially if there are portions that are recorded, you're making sure that you're providing consistent information, but also you're only recording it once. And then of course it gives access and the opportunity to connect during this crisis. Lots of benefits, but I also think it's important to acknowledge that online training is not the only way, and it's not necessarily the best way. It's one option within a whole array of training. And so I want to talk about that in a moment. But before I switch on to that sort of view of a comprehensive look at training, I also want you to be thinking about, if you haven't already, not just how you're going to continue to train any new volunteers, but for the volunteers who've been on hiatus, who are beginning to come back, what sort of retraining do they need for new protocols or a refresher course on information, so that you're creating a unified and equipped and knowledgeable volunteer corps to carry you forward. While I think virtual training is really important and a great option, it also isn't necessarily a standalone option. It really should be part of a larger comprehensive vision of training curriculum that's guided by a couple questions like this. And if you're are interested in going into this in more depth, I'll be spending one of these workshops through the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits dedicated to virtual volunteering and virtual training design. So, what are the discrete chunks of information that any new or current volunteer needs to know? What are the knowledge, the skills, abilities? And then what are the best instructional methods for this content? Because it's so easy for us to say, oh, we're just going to take whatever PowerPoint we did in person, and I'm just going to throw it on Zoom and create a virtual training. I hope by now you all have begun playing with different approaches as we think about how to carry this forward, and think about factors like the audience size, the learning objectives, who else can be involved with you, and what are the features of your platform. Because online presentations really should be one part of a larger curriculum that includes homework, or could include homework or pre-reading, participant guides, in-person meetings, maybe mentorship and on-the-job training, what sort of continuing education, what kind of check-in calls. All of these can help shape our training in the future and enhance it. But we've had this great boost of interest and comfort with online training that I don't want us to lose. There are a lot of benefits to that, but we can look at it now that we're able to be back together more, look at it as part of a whole and take what works. The next piece is rethinking retention. We've talked a little bit about recruitment, and we have those traditional 3 R's of volunteer engagement: recruitment, retention, and recognition. Retention is that center piece in those traditional 3 R's. And it really, even prior to 2020, was undergoing a bit of a rethinking, I won't say quite it was a revolution, but I think we have an opportunity to make a revolution in it now. And yet there was no accepted definition of retention. Most often, retention was considered hours or events or shifts being filled, right? How many did we retain enough volunteers to meet that capacity to fill all those spots? Sometimes it was defined by certain organizations as year over year, what percentage of volunteers stayed the next year, and how many years of service did they have. But given the trends that I shared with volunteers seeking shorter term, more flexible opportunities, being less interested, fewer volunteers being interested in long-term commitments to stay in the same role, there really had begun to be a sea change of thought around what retention means. For some organizations, they were beginning to look at retention simply as, did the volunteer fulfill the commitment that was made? Did the volunteers fulfill their required commitments? Did they show up, or were they available consistently? Did they maintain certifications that would make them eligible? Let's say you're one of your New Hampshire, Vermont Red Cross, and I may have seen someone on the call from there. I'm not sure. And if you were, sometimes it's a matter of ensuring that you have volunteers who maintain their certifications to be eligible to be called out in case of disaster or community need. I have always believed that we shouldn't work to retain individuals. Rather, we should work as engagement professionals to sustain a culture of engagement and to sustain relationships with those individuals, recognizing that there are many ways for people to stay connected to our mission. Even if they're inactive as volunteers, they could be advocates quite actively for our organization. I have a colleague who blogs about volunteer engagement, Meridian Swift, and she wrote something that I thought was really interesting perspective recently on retention. So pardon me while I quote her comments. She says, "We have to stop the misconception that volunteers are possessions. And until we throw them out, they will keep coming back up to the moment that they wear out or die. Instead, let's speak of volunteers as temporary from the start. If volunteers are viewed as permanent fixtures, why work hard to keep them? But if we know they're fleeting, it makes sense to work hard to engage them. Their worth increases because they will leave. And I just thought that was an interesting perspective. When we think about how organizations have shifted in terms of their goals around retention, and I certainly have heard over the last year challenges, how do I keep volunteers engaged? And so I had the chance to interview Brittany Mcgarry from the MS Society. She's the event volunteer coordinator for the MS Society of Colorado, Wyoming market. So you might imagine there weren't a lot of events in the last year. So what was keeping her busy? Well, she decided to shift from traditional recruitment of trying to get people from outside in to instead really thinking about how can she cultivate their event volunteers for more or different work. How do you take a cadre of volunteers who are used to volunteering episodically, day of event volunteers, and transform them into ongoing volunteers in new roles? So here's what she did in her work. She knew that it was time to see if these day of event volunteers might be interested in engaging beyond day of events. So she reached beyond her traditional realm of influence where she normally could engage and place people, and contacted other departments, advocacy departments, fundraising departments. And with their blessing, she sent out a survey in December with a list of opportunities. She sent it to all the volunteers in the Colorado, Wyoming market. And since January, she's been meeting with volunteers who completed the survey. She's been meeting with them one-on-one to see which areas are the right fit for them. She's meeting with any and all of the individuals who expressed elevated interest. The ones who want action alerts, she sends them an email, says, great, I'll sign you up for action alerts. Those interested in sharing their story, in committees, in other types of active advocacy work, she set up an exploratory meeting and called them. And within just the first few weeks of this year, she was able to elevate multiple volunteers to event committees, advocacy work, community councils, in addition to creating a running list of people interested in making phone calls, writing thank you notes, and other projects. And she had people coming out of the woodwork, some who've been there 10 years, and now that they've been asked and had this opportunity to rethink their engagement, they're interested in doing more. So this has become part of her annual plan to reach out and set aside time for these meetings. And that was really part of looking at, retention doesn't have to be same people in same roles year over year or maintaining a number of hours contributed. It's how do we maintain this relationship? And if she loses event volunteers to advocacy, that's still a win for MS. Fourth is measuring impact. Shifting retention also ties to shifting impact measurement. I have spoken to countless volunteer engagement professionals who've bemoaned that their annual report took a hit, as I mentioned. Volunteer hours were down for 2020. Volunteer numbers were down. Yes, food assistance organizations, senior services often were up, but arts, sport, even health have been hit hard. And that's really because the metrics were hours and numbers as the only success metrics. But what about all the other amazing things that have happened? The number of new volunteers, diversification of age of the volunteer corps, number of meals served to families, number of friendly calls delivered to isolated adults, conversion of volunteers to financial donors. There are lots of success stories, and it's incumbent upon us to tell those stories. On the screen, you can see there's a lot of different examples of looking at volunteer impacts and outcomes that get beyond the traditional hours and numbers. But if you're struggling at all to think about, gosh, what things could we be measuring? I'd encourage you to check out the Value of Volunteering Wheel that was put together by Volunteer Canada back in 2016. It's a really neat tool that helps us It's based on the premise that volunteering has the capacity to build confidence, competence, connections, and community. And that potential to build those things looks different for different stakeholder groups. For the volunteers, building confidence might mean enhancing their well-being. For competence, it might be about skills development. But competence for the organization is access to those skills. Competence for businesses might be workforce development, that you're equipping a new generation of skilled laborers, skilled workers to support and run businesses in our community. For neighborhoods, it might be that you're building leadership competence in your community. And for society as a whole, competence can look like informed public policy. So this type of, oh, thank you, Aislinn, for putting that link in there. Yay, quick work, nice. And it's a really neat website. It's actually interactive. If you click on one of the wedges, it'll like shoot you down to an article about that kind of measurement. Some are in French for you bilingual people, and some are in English, but most are in English. But it's a great tool. And so I'd encourage you, if you're thinking about what else can we measure, what story can we tell, take one aspect of your volunteer strategy, one program, one area, and use a filter like this. No one endeavor is going to fill in every box. That would be too much and unrealistic and probably maybe too lofty of a goal. But to use a filter like you see on the screen and say, how does helping refugees understand what the census is, which we worked with an organization in New Hampshire last year around, how does that help not just the volunteers and our organization, but also neighborhoods and society as a whole? How might senior, check-in calls to seniors, what does that do in terms of sense of belonging for the volunteers, community engagement for the organization? Does it tap into our neighborhoods for neighborhood cohesion? That helps us tell our story and also determine what metrics we should be collecting so that we can actually have proof if our promise is working, if we're coming true on our promise to the community and to our mission. And the last piece as we begin to wrap up and get ready to open it up for some questions is the idea of redefining community. Why should we think about community and interpersonal relationships within a volunteer corps? Well, because community and connection are what draws people to volunteer. Certainly people volunteer to make a difference first and foremost, but even that has to do with community and that people want to be in community with others that make a difference. Researcher and author Charles Vogel says, when leaders create a robust and committed community, they build relationships that are effective and resilient. According to Vogel, a community is a group of people who share mutual concern for one another. In other words, members of community believe that others in the community care about them. So can we develop or nurture community amid this hybrid world? I think that many of us already have, and that we need to continue to do that, but we have to work differently in order to create a community out of a hybrid workforce. There's reasons to do it, and that's because when communities are working, members grow in the ways that they hope to. It might be socially, technologically, internally. It can help members feel more connected, welcome, proud, and excited to be part of your group. It helps members work together toward making that difference, that mission fulfillment that you're envisioning. And of course, it makes membership, formal or informal, more fun. And that's a good thing. So I'd like to once again get your voices in the room here and have you weigh in our second poll and ask you to share which strategy this is only a pick one, which strategy have you found to be most effective in nurturing a sense of community over the past year? And if your most effective strategy isn't on here, feel free to type it in the chat. Is it volunteer roles that require teamwork, team leaders who are responsible, for nurturing community, training events, social media. What has worked for you? And once again, you can sing the little Jeopardy tune. I will spare you mine. And we're gonna close the poll in, let's get a couple other answers in there. We're gonna close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Perfect, I was hoping to get over 70%. Okay, so the highest one has been educational and training events, which is great. But I also am delighted to see that more than 1 in 5 of you have developed roles for volunteers that require teamwork. That certainly builds a nice integrated community. 12% have team leaders responsible for nurturing community. That's great. Social events, of course, and social media. So thank you. Thank you for weighing in. Let me share a couple final thoughts on the community piece. And if you're intrigued with this, I'd encourage you to read Vogel's book, The Art of Community. And we'll be doing a whole session on this in our upcoming webinar series. He has identified through his research 7 principles of community. And it's been really wonderful over the last year to work with organizations to imagine how these different principles can be and are being applied in volunteer engagement. You don't need all 7, but you need a critical mass of them to have a cohesive community. How are you creating opportunities to indicate a boundary when new volunteers are really part of your volunteer community, even if they're engaging virtually? What are the activities that help welcome people in that maybe we used to do a certain way when we were all in person and might be needing to do differently now that we have people engaging from all over? Are there rituals or the things that we did that had meaning, giving people badges or welcome lunches? What are those things? How do we adapt them? Space, stories, symbols, and leadership growth are all elements that contribute to community building. So if you're intrigued, I'd encourage you to check out that book or come to the webinar in a couple of weeks. Ultimately, as we build back better, what we're seeing is the organizations who are positioning themselves to do that, position engagement as a strategy, they've embraced innovation, they're sharing their impact, and the volunteer engagement professionals are leading. They're leading by creating plans for recovery, reopening, and return, which I think is the handout that you'll have accessible to you. If not, we'll be happy to provide it. But it's a tool that can help you be proactive in planning for the return to engagement. And it's designed to align with your organization's reopening plan. And they're also embracing language and structures that position volunteer engagement as a strategy that's vital to recovery, not just as a program that's nice to have. And when they do that, you and your colleagues as volunteer engagement professionals are focusing not just on managing the day, but really leading the strategy, focusing on a vision for the future, aligning people with that vision, and inspiring others to engage with you, both your paid employee colleagues and volunteers, to achieve that vision. And when we do that, we'll be better positioned to build back better. And I encourage you to do that. So with that, we have about 7-8 minutes. I want to thank you so much for your time and your participation. And Joan notes that there are handouts, and my slides will be available to all registrants. And I'm happy to open it up for a couple questions. Joan, do we have any?
I haven't seen, or there's one from Johnny Jordan. What would you say is the best strategy for recruiting and retaining more youth volunteers, specifically in an organization whose volunteers are largely age 50 plus?
Great question. And I will also encourage others to weigh in if you have successful strategies. For youth, I'd say there's a couple things. First, partnerships are really key. If you're in an area that has high schools or community colleges or colleges that have community service requirements, I would get to know those community service leaders, your National Honor Society folks, your, for high schools, and make those opportunities available. I would make sure that you're posting online and that you're making the requirements align with students' availability. They're not going to be able to volunteer if most of the volunteer time slots are between 9 and 1 on weekdays, because many students and youth are in school. So is your schedule available? And is it flexible? Is there a minimum requirement that's realistic for a student? Are you in an area where there could be transportation available? And what sort of training are you providing? Because for many youth, this is a new opportunity, and we can't assume that they understand all the protocols and expectations. So it's helpful to provide some training that is youth focused. But I'd say partnerships are one of the key pieces. So that's one piece. Do we have any other questions?
Not that I've seen. I think you answered them along the way.
Okay. And nice to see, I see some hellos from Charlotte and others. It's been great to see everyone. So I will just let everyone know, this is where you can get information. There we go. Leslie just posted the information I have on the screen here for our upcoming sessions with in partnership with Volunteer New Hampshire and the New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits. If you want to dive into any of these topics, we're going to be spending 90 minutes on each of these 5 in the coming weeks. And I hope to see some of you there. In the meantime, I really hope that you will embrace your role as leaders in leading this effort to build back. And when I say build back better, I don't mean that we weren't in good shape before, but we have this opportunity to choose. Are we going to move forward and just carry with us the practices that got us to 2019 and 2020? Or can we take some of these lessons to create a future, as you see from this great Peter Drucker quote, that will enable us to continue to be adaptable and sustainable as we face whatever the future has in store for us. So thank you and good luck. And thanks for letting me be part of this conference. Joan?
Thank you again to Beth for joining us from Colorado today. Her contact information has been shared in the chat box, as well as the information on the session starting next week. As a reminder, the recording of this session and the slides will be shared at volunteernh.org. We'll send an email when they are posted, so make sure that info@volunteernh.org has been added to your safe senders list so you don't miss it. Registration is still open for the remaining Governor's Conference sessions today and the trivia contest and final session tomorrow at noontime. In the chat, you'll see a link to a survey where you can tell us your thoughts on this session and any others you attend. You can come back to the survey multiple times or wait till the end of the conference. The link is the same either way. If you fill out the survey by May 31st, you will be entered into a drawing to win a prize. For another chance to win, you can also submit an intent to nominate form for the 2021 Spirit of New Hampshire Awards. This is your opportunity to recognize an outstanding volunteer, group of volunteers, and an organization that champions volunteerism. Filling out the form does not count as nominating. We'll just reach out to you once we begin officially accepting nominations. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you again, Beth, for joining us.